Uh-oh. I think you just lost me. Oh, this is just.
I can hear you, Renee. You're still here. You're still with us.
Okay.
Maybe stop the video and come back with the video later.
Okay. I am so sorry for this. I'm going to stay on the phone call and see what's going on here.
No worries. I am going to let people in if you all are ready. Yeah, good to go? Okay. Oh, they're in, cool. So Renee, whenever you're ready to do intros, I think we're ready to rock.
Okay, so I'm going to have to do this. You don't see me, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, I can't get in, so I'll just talk. So good afternoon, and thank you. My name is Renee Ater. I am visiting associate professor in Africana Studies at Brown University. This afternoon, it is my real pleasure to have a conversation with funmilayo and Matthew Garza, who are both Parkists artists in residence. So I just have a few kind of introductory remarks that I'd like to say today, and then we will have presentations by Fumi and Garza, and then Fumi, Garza, and I will join in a conversation. So first of all, I would like to acknowledge that PVD Fest is produced by the City of Providence through the Department of Art, Culture, and Tourism, and the founding partners First Works, the Mayor Elorza, and the Providence City Council. Thank you to the City of Providence Parks Department and co-sponsor of the Parkists in Residence program. And special thanks also to the Art in City Life Commission, whose work makes our public art program possible. And thank you to our PVD Fest Ideas curatorial partners at the Rhode Island Historical Society, the Rhode Island Council on the Humanities, and the Providence Public Library. And then Matthew, Micah, I'm gonna toss it right back at you to do the land acknowledgement.
I will share my screen, 1 second. We acknowledge that we are occupying the land stewarded by the first peoples who inhabited this area, the Narragansett, the people of the Little Point, or the people of the points and bays, and the Wampanoag, the people of the First Light, or the people of the East. We recognize and honor the living legacies of Indigenous people across what we now call Providence for their cultural stewardship and for teaching those who arrived at this land by choice and by force to consider our lifetime within the context of the next 7 generations. Fumi, if you want to start in on your presentation, I'm spotlighting you.
Sounds good. We can start with the next slide. Hello, everyone. Or Asko Wakwasunu and Tampawag. My name is Fumi. I am one of the Parkists in residence during this program. I want to get started with a few slides first, and then I can get more into who I am, what I do, and some of the things that I've been working on over the last year and a half. Next slide, please. So we'll get started with some community homemaking projects. And there may be a little bit of a lag with this video, just due to compression and Google Drive. And next slide when you're ready, Micah. Yeah. So again, hello all. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to everyone on this panel and all of those involved in sharing space today. It is an honor to be sharing, albeit virtual space with you all today. So here, the previous video that was shown is I was a part of a year-long project for the All Black Lives Matter mural that is currently installed downtown in between Kennedy Plaza and Burnside Park. And here, just offering a slide with some contextualizing information. Here's an image from that day. Well, very long weekend in the month at the end of the month of June, or maybe it was the first week of July, um, during the heat wave, installing it with community members, comrades, organizers, and just wanted to highlight that this community-oriented project steered by a community of Providence-based artists, organizers, and educators formed to develop and design a large-scale street mural intended to honor the histories, experiences, communities, identities, and aesthetics of Black people and Black culture in Providence, Rhode Island. And with our also decision to include all in All Black Lives Matter to honor and uplift queer and trans experiences within the Black community, both locally, regionally, and nationwide, and across the world. So here I also want to highlight just folks who have touched the project, have changed the project, include Zuli Vidal, Lizzie Arroyo, Rodney Davis, Nafis White, Keith Stokes, Sonny Stokes, Wanda Brown, Sage Morgan Hubbard, Nicole Scott, and to further highlight the work and artists who developed, designed, and installed the mural with the volunteers were myself, Rodney Abendason, Vesna Shelf, Nafis White, Ayel Schofield, Sarah Samways, and other folks involved with the project were Juan Rodriguez, Angel Newman, Marco McWilliams, and Matthew Garza. I also want to add, and my apologies, Gina Rodriguez from ACT also supported us in seeing the project through. Next slide, please. And this is just a still image. Yeah, and my apologies for the glitchy video. If you want to see it, please make sure to get downtown Kennedy Plaza. You can drive over it, you can walk alongside it, and we can talk about it more later in the panel. Next slide, please. And again, my artist name is K Funmilayo Aileru. I go by Fumi for short. I use Z and they pronouns. I'm a queer Black Native artist. I'm a member of the Narragansett Nation of Rhode Island, being of Narragansett Niantic lineage. And I'm also first-gen Nigerian American, specifically Yoruba. Professionally, I am an artist, curator, and critic. I use many different materials and media to work with concepts such as enslavement, dispossession, and genocide. Much of my work examines historical and contemporary relationships between technology, Black liberation, and Indigenous sovereignty. I experiment with expanding and transforming social constructs through speculative perspectives and criticisms. Again, I'm a Rhode Island native. I'm specifically from the south side of Providence. And I'm also a co-founding member of Black Earth Collective and Lab. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the collective I just mentioned. We're a collective of queer and trans, Black and Indigenous artists, craftspeople, and designers. We learn, organize, and teach within our communities to honor and build upon our ancestors' legacies of originality, imagination, and transformation. Black Earth Collective and Lab nurtures creative opportunity and elevates cultural art and craft of queer and trans Black and Indigenous communities. Our founding members are myself, Koti Nayan, Jesus Halgwin, Justice Gaines, Edvi Charlot, and Monet McNeil. Next slide, please. A current project that we are working with Providence Youth Student Movement. And when I say me, we, I'm talking about Black Earth Collective and Lab. Right now, PRISM is doing their summer nonviolent direct action training series. So Jesus and I, on the behalf of Black Earth, we're supporting young people in creative expression and design and communication as it concerns nonviolent direct action and sort of the principles and practices they're learning throughout the month of July. Next slide, please. An excerpt from my philosophy to sort of give context to my practice. I believe that collaboration should be intergenerational, center experience, experimentation, and relation to community, culture, and space or place. Collective work, I think, should critically and creatively engage with social, political, and environmental dynamics as it concerns identities, experience, and surroundings. Next slide, please. And then as it concerns my residency specifically, this has also been a time for me, as well as my family and my community, to do some homemaking or home make through gardening. We specifically have been exploring our indigenous foods, plant medicine, and cultural practices around growing food, being a relation to plants, crops, and other beings. Myself, as well as my indigenous community and my family, we do believe that we are made up of all of our relations. So with that, it's been over the last, starting last summer, exploring like what native plants are to this region, and also plants and crops that are sacred to my tribe, the Narragansett, as well as with my family, some other diasporic plants, herbs, and flowers that are both like culturally and spiritually relevant to us. So here, the first image to the right being, or to the left, excuse me, including Boston marrow squash, which is an indigenous squash to this region, as well as Lenape flint corn, although that may not be my tribe specifically, is still of this area. This year, what you see in the blue buckets, we are growing King's Philip red flint corn, which is a Rhode Island flint, as well as other sort of flowers and herbs you see going here. Something that is not as local, but we are cultivating because it's culturally a part of our diets through, whether it was the transatlantic slave trade, immigration, migration patterns, amaranth. So just want to highlight some of how homemaking is sort of showing up in my practice and community and with family. Next slide, please. And then just to sort of wrap it up, some upcoming projects that I have, and this is specifically concerning curation. So this fall, I have two projects coming up, one being Black Visual Practice, which is which honors the spiritual foundation of Black visual work and uplifts intergenerational aesthetic wisdom and vision. The exhibition features work of local Black, young and elder artists. Included works are informed by various experiences and intersections, as well as spiritual traditions. So that is curated by myself, with support from Neil Walsh, who is director of galleries at ASU 20, and will be an 8-born gallery. Next slide, please. I'm also curating with support from a local artist and curator and professor Ari Montford at the University of Rhode Island. The show is called Constellations and Cartographies Black. It is a two-person exhibition featuring the artworks of Edvi Charlot and Kyle B. Coe. The artists approach concepts concerning assemblage or assemblage in Black diaspora through collage and installation. Next slide, please. A couple of recent works, both during pandemic and right before, pre-pandemic, is Current. So Current is a digital time-based installation, which appropriates the concept of New and Old Jerusalem to visualize Earth relationship to Mars as a frontier, as constructed by the West. The intention of Current is to illustrate our earthly tether to imaginaries and realities of heaven and hell. This installation is activated by graphics, interchange format or a gift, and LCD screens. This work was a part of the Sculpting Reality Information in Our Hands exhibition, co-curated by Becky Davis and Benjamin Lundberg Torres Sanchez at the Jamestown Art Center in 2020. Next slide. And that's supposed to say 2019. We have Exodus 26:36. This installation contemplates solitude, isolation as informed by Judeo-Christian history and iconography, and employs Mars exploration propaganda as a vehicle of expanding these westernized notions. This exhibit, which was a solo show of mine, was curated by D.S. Kinzel at Boom Concepts in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Next slide, please. And to sort of wrap it up, I wanted to end with what I call on my site a land acknowledgement. It is my artist statement. And it reads, I inhabit a horrendous nightmare that is eclipsed by the legacy of alien invasion. I am a descendant of both alien abductees and survivors of alien experimentation. For this reason, my creative practice is situated in a post-colonial speculative space that is beyond Earth. My Blackness, indigeneity, and queerness expands beyond the bounds of my earthly tether to death and the dying. This practice is not a vehicle for escapism, but is a mechanism to actualize radical imagination and creative organizing. Next slide. And I think that might be the entire presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Fumi. I really appreciate it. Everyone can hear me loudly? So the next presenter will be Matthew Garza, and then we'll talk after you're done, Garza. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. Okay. So today I'll be sharing about our historical intervention in the former home of Isaac Hopkins, commander of the slave ship Sally, the home where Isaac Hopkins died in 1802. Before I do, however, I'd like to invite everyone to take 3 deep breaths with me. I'll invite you to close your eyes and place your hands over your heart so you can feel your heart beating. First, a breath of gratitude for whatever comes to mind, breathing in and out. A breath for all of the ancestors we bring to this moment. May we learn from their stories told and untold, breathing in and out. A breath for the intentions and well-being of everyone with us in this virtual space and those from the future who are viewing this archive, breathing in and out. Thank you. First, I'd love to honor my grandparents, Agosta Vera Garcia, artist and healer, Jose Garcia, educator and activist, Remigio Garza, earth worker and organizer and healer, and Ramona Figueroa Garza, artist, educator, and healer. I want to honor my indigenous Tejano ancestors of the US-Mexican border, who imagined my existence and fought against colonization again and again and again and again. I also want to acknowledge that our work at the House of Glitter is in lineage and collaboration with queer, femme, and BIPOC legacies, community leaders, and ancestors who have fought for change so that we can be having this conversation. None of us would be in this work together without their courage, wisdom, and magic. To share a little bit more about my practice, as Dr. Renee said, my name is Matthew Rolando Garza, son of Rolando and Nelda Garza of Alice, Texas and San Diego, Texas. By training, I'm a dancer and choreographer, multidisciplinary performance artist, historian, and educator who works at the intersection of historical cultural preservation, liberation pedagogy, and decolonization strategy. Today, I'm here representing my family, my fiance, Anthony Andrade of Cape Verde and West Africa, and my godbrother, whose government name is Trent, but goes by his artist name Trash, of West Africa and the local Narragansett people. For the last 18 months, we have been living in the former home of Isaac Hopkins, commander of the slave ship Sally. I'm also here representing the House of Glitter Dance Company, a performance ensemble, art collective, record label, and justice advocacy organization. We work through movement and choreography to shift the energetic center of the universe towards queer feminist BIPOC liberation. In our work, we strive to embody ancestral liberation, healing, and love in every step and every breath of our creative process and pedagogy. Our choreography aims to reach beyond the stage and into the streets, into our homes, into our institutions, and into our hearts. After 18 months of living and working and healing in Isaac Hopkins' former home, our historic intervention can be broken down into 5 core projects: institutional advancement, internal healing, earth justice, historic disruption, and homemaking, which is the focus of our conversation today. Institutional advancements. So community engagement has been integral to our process. Throughout this residency, we've collaborated with local BIPOC elders, artists, and legacy projects, produced social justice focused community programs, expanded our school-based arts partnerships, and coordinated over $15,000 in COVID-19 relief. The work of this residency has demanded advocacy and organization to push municipal, state, and national and international institutions toward liberatory practice. We've also taught over 200 free and donation-based community yoga, meditation, and dance classes for over 12,000 participants. We even distributed teas, herbs, and farm produce and groceries to our neighborhood and community. Internal healing. Since moving into this home, I began writing 32 love letters to my mother and creating 32 performance pieces. This project is titled Bless Me Ultimex and is dedicated to my personal healing, my mother's healing, and the healing for all those who struggle with the intersection of queerness, colonization, and the patriarchy. We've also hosted 10 artists of color in what we are calling artist residencies to support the care, restoration, and healing of BIPOC creative practitioners. Earth justice. Because COVID did not allow us to manifest our vision for indoor community programming and performances, we launched the Liberation Garden, an outdoor community earth space for intergenerational art making, teaching, learning, and environmental justice organizing, cooperatively run and maintained by ourselves, our neighborhood, as well as local youth and environmental justice organizations. In fact, we're running a free 4-week summer camp for middle school in the Liberation Garden this month. Historical disruption. Our activist dance opera, The Historical Fantasy of Isaac Hopkins, begins with the story of the woman, the kidnapped African woman who hung herself on the first voyage of the slave ship Sally, commanded by Isaac Hopkins. The story begins with her life and the legacy she left behind for us. In addition to sharing indigenous cultural magic from West Africa, the Caribbean, Latin America, the Narragansett and Wampanoag people, and Laos, our activist dance opera shares a fantasy that we've created to imagine the missing stories from the legacy of Isaac Hopkins, to imagine what life would be like today if colonization or slavery never happened, to rehearse for a world that centers healing, care, and community. We believe we are carrying on this legacy to refuse complicity, to refuse oppression, and to refuse silence. We are so excited to be premiering a workshop of this project this September, September 9th, in fact, for a 6-night run in cooperation with PVD Fest, the Wilbury Theater, Pronk, and the Rhode Island Foundation. Homemaking. The focus of this conversation. This is a project of family liberation. The reality is this house was not a suitable home when we first moved in. I swear we swept up Isaac Hopkins' dead skin cells into a dustpan, y'all. We have documented our homemaking practice meticulously, from our weekly family sacred time to our experience moving in and rearranging our furniture, our possessions, our hearts, our bodies, and our minds. Aside from physically making a home, which took 13 months due to construction delays in the house, our work in this residency has called us to investigate what it means to be a queer family of color today. What will make us feel safe here? What do we need to not just feel free, but to be free? What does it mean for us to be living, sleeping, cooking, grieving, healing, cleaning, and loving in this house? How can we build systems within our family that are centered around equity, care, and mutual liberation? How can we as non-binary POC, all of whom were assigned male at birth, dismantle the patriarchy in our homemaking? How can I, a light-skinned Latinx person, and my fiance, a visibly Black person, build and maintain a relationship that is centered around justice and care? I've fallen into a deeper love in this house. And yes, I can't help but say my partner, Anthony, proposed while living in this house too. Ultimately, I can say I've never lived with more intention and alignment to my values. In closing, I'd like to extend my gratitude to Micah, Gina, Lizzie, Stephanie, from the Department of Art, Culture, Tourism, Wendy, and the entire Providence Parks Department, Mara Lorza, Fumi, my partner in these 2 years, and our family, friends, and the entire city of Providence. You've changed the trajectory of our lives forever. You changed the history of this house forever. You can stay tuned and read more about the House of Glitter's historical intervention at houseofglitter.org. In closing, it's our hope that our historical intervention will set the stage for the Providence Commemorative Works Commission, the Board of Providence Parks Commission, and the Mayor's Truth and Reconciliation Committee as they consider the future of this house, the Isaac Hopkins statue, and the name of Isaac Hopkins Middle School, as well as the role our queer, feminist, BIPOC voices should play in the writing of our world's evolving history. In 2022, we hope to premiere the work on a local stage and on a nationwide school tour in 2022. From gallery and museum exhibits to performance tours and publishing, we intend to share more from these 5 abundant projects over the course of the next decade. You can support our historical intervention by going to houseofglitter.org and clicking support. Thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you so much, Garza. I really appreciate that. So, shall we start our conversation? Do you want to unmute yourself, Fumi, as well? Would be terrific. So, I thought I would start with a really big question, and it is, and then I have a question that's actually not on kind of our list of questions, but one that came to me while the both of you were talking. The first is really this idea about homemaking as resistance, which is what this panel is titled. But what does that mean to you, this notion of homemaking as resistance? I think with Garza, we get a hint of it when you talk about inhabiting space, the transformation that happens to your own life. But what does it mean, this idea around resistance and trying to make home as queer, BIPOC people in the world?
I can start. For me, homemaking.
Thank you, Fumi.
Especially as it concerns being Parkists and residents, is remembering, is reconnecting, and indigenizing space. I came into my residency not only as an Indigenous person whose relatives are Indigenous to Turtle Island, but also as a person, a Black person, who also has Indigenous lineage. And in terms of thinking about remembering not only the ancestral lands that we occupy, but also remembering my specific lineages, my elders, my ancestors, my cultural practices, and how that comes into play not only in terms of my studio practice, but also um, my how I engage my spiritual practice. It also um, has everything to do with the health and well-being, um, and the legacy, the lineage of the various communities I come from, the various communities locally that I work with. Um, and I think that remembering is critical. I think now we're contending with a shift in cultural consciousness as it concerns decolonization and land acknowledgements. Um, but for me, the radical act of resistance is growing King Philip's red flint corn on my front porch. That's what resistance looks like to me. And that's not something that's the most easily accessible thing to find. Finding native plants, finding wildflowers in these landscapes that are native or indigenous to these lands um, are challenging. That's colonization doesn't only affect people and community. If it affects all of our relations, including what we eat and what medicine that we take. So I think that I'll leave that there for that question and make space for Garza to reflect.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate your emphasis on remembering Fumi. I think, for me, that kind of illuminates to build off of the practices you mentioned, like remembering that what we inherited as homemaking practices, what we inherited as the ideal home, is like a colonized notion. And the systems that we've inherited, we have to remember that. We have to remember that our impulses and the systems that we've inherited from the generation before us are deeply colonized. And we've really been called to confront that in many ways. Homemaking is a very gendered term as well, the concept of a homemaker. So being queer, assigned male at birth, a family of queer men it gives us the graceful space to really explore what that means, to make a home together, and to dismantle, it comes up in the small moments of like, who's going to do the dishes, and paying attention to the feminine and masculine energy that exists in all of us. So, that's been a big part of our experience, building off of what Fumi said, is remembering that, like, the home that we inherited is not necessarily the home that we want. I grew up in a very traditional Mexican Tejano household where, like, my dad didn't lift a finger around the home inside, and so how can we, like, dismantle those systems? And I didn't really think of a family as a system until I moved into this house, and but it is a system. Family is a system, and there are systems in a family, whether they're named or unnamed. And that's been really illuminated in this house, where we've been called to live with so much intention. Because, I grew up also, sitting around the table, not necessarily like connecting with each other. I mean, you hear stories all the time about families not eating dinner together, or just like a lack of connection across generations between children and parents, between generations within a family. And those are not how our ancestors like viewed family. This is a very industrialized version of family and homemaking that we've been handed. So yeah, the resistance is just being willing to like dismantle and reimagine, to remember that what we have is inherited, and it is a system, and that we have the freedom to reimagine something that is more equitable and that gives space for everybody to be cared for. And you know, the pandemic of the last 2 years has illuminated that our systems in this world are not designed for our care and well-being. So that work of care-centered resistance, you know, extends outside of the home as well.
And I'd like to flip that as well. And until that moment you said that, Garza, I guess I never thought of the ways in which, yeah, my family is a system, with my partner and I being queer people, also parenting a child, and really, especially during this time and with the space and opportunity of being in residency, really, we're like reevaluating and also remembering like what our values and principles are and how they're connected to who we are, where we come from, and how we want to be, not only in the context of this specific residency, but also in the city, in the world. So yeah, I think that was a wonderful point, Garza.
Well, Fumi, I mean, it's funny, like when we got this residency, like before we got this residency, we used to take like weekly walks together. And I was like, oh great, I'm gonna see more of Fumi when we do this residency together. But we've seen so much less of each other in the last 2 years. But I have to say, like, watching you and Edwige, especially the intentionality that you brought into the transition of moving into the home, and watching the two of you build a home and like have a child in your home, like it really was so inspiring for us to pay closer attention in that specific area of homemaking. So whether you were conscious of it as a system or not, like, know that it was deeply inspiring for us down the street, as we watched you all build your home together.
Very sweet. Thank you.
Well, and I think one of the things, first of all, Garza, thank you so much for calling out, like, it is this notion of homemaking. I mean, I think of it going back to like the 19th century and women being codified in the US, and white women in certain ways of behaving in the family and organizing the family. But I love this thing that both of you are talking about, and it is, Fumi, you used the term radical active resistance, and you use care-centered resistance, Garza, and I see them as intertwined. But what I thought is really fascinating that both of you do is this idea that the earth is tied to that kind of radical active resistance, growing one's own food, the liberation garden, and then your Black Earth garden, that both of those things, those interactions with the ecology, the environment, the thing around you, the land, it seems really essential. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that just a little bit, about how that might, a little bit more. I know, Fumi, you talked about it in your presentation, but I'm really interested in this idea that growing an indigenous plant, returning to those herbal medicines that have this really extended and very long tradition in your communities, right? And I think, Garza, you were talking about this in some similar ways. So if you could talk about this, like care-centered resistance, I really like that language. And Garza, I'll just have to say, I'm also fascinated that you're incorporating yoga and meditation into the community as this kind of radical care-centered resistance as well, which is super important, right, for communities that may not be exposed to these modalities. So I don't know, either one could start around that idea of the tie really to the land.
Sure, I can start. And yeah, so my partner and I, Edwige, who's also a co-founder of Black Earth Lab, we've been just spending a lot of time and intention, like, you know, around just figuring out like what our native plants are, what they do, how ourselves, our people in our communities have been in relation and in connection to, you know, various. This year, we're focusing more on flowers and herbs. We do grow on a plot in Seekonk with the Tooth and Nail Community Support Collective. And last year when we started, I'm a very, um, fiery Aries. I wanted to go all in. We started with the three sisters, which were corned beans and squash, community members, and also my tribal family. It was a community effort with like locating who had seeds, where I could find Rhode Island, New England, or Narragansett specific seed, um, and having tribal members help me do that research, sending me what they had, for folks who were already growing that, connected me to other elders and uh, people of other indigenous communities and also cousin communities. Um, and and I just sort of like my family, and we also with my partner also being Haitian and Creole, my father's lineage being Nigerian, Yoruba. Also, we have a lot of conversation with our family, our extended families around the foods that we have in common, what our parents and our grandparents have grown at home, what those foods, what those herbs, what those flowers, what do they do? Can we grow them here, or can we be in collaboration with someone who can grow it? So that's definitely been, I feel like, growing up with an indigenous parent, like you're taught that you're of your relations, that you need to be land-based and be in mutual aid and response to what's around you. But I think in terms of like being intentional around working and tending to the land, and growing, I feel like that my personal capacity is definitely deepened and widened quite a bit. I've been just doing a lot of like my own studying of what is here, what was here. I also been in a grieving process of there's I was reading some texts from other Algonquin native healers and medicine people, and just talking about how a lot of our plant relatives did not survive contact, or either we're not able, um, we're just not in a position where we're able to find them or connect with them or recognize them, or they may just be gone. And it just recently, just doing those studies, um, I I realized too in trying to indigenize my practice, re-indigenize my home, that there is a grieving process that takes place in order to move forward, um, and sort of like come into the sort of next cycle, and also to figure out like what I can not only build for my descendants, but also for my ancestors. So being it creates just a hyper awareness of positionality, for myself, my partner, my family, and my extended family. So.
I guess like before moving into this house, my experiences with earthwork were also very gendered. Again, like, growing up, I would mow the lawns and do things outside rather than necessarily do things indoors, or it was always like a labor of my masculinity. And so I always really wasn't able to look past that aspect of that labor as a masculine labor. And so I felt very disconnected from earth, even though my family is a long line of earth workers. And so we didn't necessarily come into the house with the intention to have a community garden, but we did come into the house with the intention to really look at earth systems as intelligence. And in the same way that, like, as dancers, our body has a system, and we believe that the body's systems has so much intelligence for our social justice work and for our internal healing. We also came in with at least the conviction that earth has wisdom to tap into as well, and that our ancestors, risked their lives to make sure that wisdom was preserved. And when we examined kind of like myself, my partner Anthony, and my godson Trent's, kind of all of our lineage and our relationship with earth labor, we realized that, like, you know, many of our ancestors were not laboring on earth by choice for some period of time. And so there was a power in deciding to plant for ourselves. We hadn't had a land or a yard, or I haven't had a yard in, like, since I left my childhood home in 2007. So this was the first time I had a yard. So logistically it was possible. We had a whole park, in fact. And my partner Anthony participated in the Creative Health Worker Fellowship with the Department of Art, Culture, Tourism, and his work there to really investigate the systems of earth and how they can contribute not just to personal healing, but community healing, not just the our plant relatives themselves having healing properties and properties for our well-being, but then also how the systems and the systems of plants and how they grow and how they thrive and how they thrive in community with one another could influence our process as well. So we've learned so much in the process of tending to earth and really reestablishing that this is, you know, it is for our sustenance and not for a masculine labor, not for a racialized labor. It's for our family and community's well-being. So it's taken on a whole new meaning over the last 2 years.
So I think that's really, it's profound, right? This kind of reconnection to the land that you're talking about, Garza, and Fumi, this ancestral connection. I mean, I think you're both in effect talking about an ancestral connection that may have been forgotten that is now able to be retrieved, right, from the past. And I'm really intrigued by that. I have a question that's a little bit different, if I may, and that is, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. I see you as maybe working, the two of you, from two different locations. And so, Fumi, you write a lot about memory and trauma and otherness in your artist statements, and about how you're thinking about performance and your art making and your digital art making. And then, Garza, I see this idea of, partly because of the yoga and the meditation and the way that you're engaged in the community, but you use the language of creating compassionate spaces. And so I see those as being perhaps two different takes, but they may be interconnected. But I'm wondering if you could talk about that, because Garza, you talk about cultivating freedom, strength, radical self-care, and revolutionary movement as part of your kind of art making process. Where for me, I really understand that you're doing some kind of looking to the future and envisioning something different, but also from, you mentioned the word grief, actually. And I find that really powerful, like this long history of grief that can't just be let go, right? So you're doing this reclamation process, but grief is there. So could you address those? They're two different things, I think, or what do you all think about that?
That's interesting. I mean, I think, you know, I'm curious what Fumi would say as well, but I think this idea of otherness and grief and memory and futurism is so essential for building compassionate spaces. Like that is the radicalness that we use to build, and so often I think, you know, a space that might not be a compassionate space, a compassionate community, or a compassionate institution is lacking a fundamental awareness of otherness, is lacking a fundamental, you know, lack of awareness around many of the issues and many of these like dimensions of being that Fumi highlights in their work. I see our work very hand in hand. I mean, I guess because we do work hand in hand oftentimes.
Yeah, we do. And I think, and my apologies, my phone was vibrating. I think that, let me get my thoughts together. I do think that they go hand in hand, and I think that there's a meshing. I often think in terms of the work, the sort of speculative or quote unquote like futurist work that I do is often associated with, you know, colonial advancement of technology, the quote unquote future. just the advancement of civilization, which are very Western, very um, very patriarchal, very colonist perspectives on what um, the future is or can be. I think where I come from in my work, with specifically examining, grappling with, wrestling with, to sort of bring the concept back of grief, of grieving dispossession, grieving um, enslavement, grieving genocide. Um, I think to indigenous people and indigenous communities, we continue to be under occupation. We continue to inhabit a nightmare. Um, the the apocalypse and dystopia is here. It's not something that's in the future. It's something that is present day, past, and for a foreseeable future. And I think what I bring into my work, in and dealing with, for lack of a better phrase, I think that also my creative practice is a spiritual practice, and that sometimes I do consider it a form of visual shadow work. Um, I I think that, like being in constant resistance to these conventional science fiction, fantasy, even horror narratives, um, and to look beyond that, um, or to even just thinking about, reparations, land back, like it is expected that indigenous people, whether it be the indigenous people of Turtle Island, the indigenous people of Africa, the indigenous people of all the lands of these worlds, to consent to continue to be under occupation. And I think that I think culturally speaking, um, in my work and also that of Garza, um, House of House of Glitter, um, just really doing work around like what those things, what that could look like, what resistance looks like, um, refusal, and also to really question and sometimes antagonize consent around occupation. So I kind of went off on a tangent. I don't know if I ultimately answered your question, but those are the things that come up for me when thinking about what you had asked, Dr. Renee.
Well, and Fumi, it also like, we've been collaborators on just like process for a very long time. So I think like what you're speaking to really illuminates like how much process matters, in the maintenance, in the maintenance of systems, of colonizing systems, in the maintenance of occupation. Process matters. And if we're so there's like the awareness of reimagining something different, and also the awareness of like how we're doing it now is a colonized system. And so the process for artists, but also for community workers, is often very product oriented. And we live in a very production oriented society, which has been tested and tried in the last 2 years, where we've been forced to think about care and wellness. And so, yeah, I think like where Fumi and our work converge really is in like the importance and the integrity of our process, and an insistence to bring that integrity to our process, to our collaborations, and to our work, with the city of Providence, as well.
No, I appreciate actually what you're both saying, this idea of the visual shadow work and the process. And I guess what I'm interested in, and you've talked about this a little bit at the edges, but I'd like you to address it maybe more directly as the Parkists in residence, with this kind of connection to the historic space. What is the role of the historical in your practice? And I know, obviously, for me, you're talking about looking back, but how do those interventions happen? You know, you're talking, Garza, about being in this home, in the Essex Hopkins house. Like, what is that like? Like that, the historical presence, right? So that it is the past, but it's also presence and it's a future. So what is that experience like? And how might you articulate this historical in your work? And Fumi, that's for you too.
Yeah, I mean, talking about remembering, there are reminders all around our households of colonization and slavery and the patriarchy, just everywhere you look. So there is like such an immense heaviness, and, ours and Fumi's parks have different histories, and ours has a particularly weighted history with a particular role in the transatlantic slave trade during the time when Rhode Island was responsible for 70 to 90% of transatlantic slavery, period. So Rhode Island has such a major role, and Esek Hopkins has such a specific role. For me, he represents like complicity, maybe even complicit neutrality. Was he the one trading enslaved people? Was he the one kidnapping people? Was he, he was driving the ship, he was commanding the ship. And so there's a complicity there that is very palpable in the space and in his role. So, it's been very heavy for us to sit with that history and the ways like I didn't expect to feel, and for my family to feel that burden so deeply of just this house was not meant for us. Like, and in truth, what's really been illuminated in having to deal with that heaviness and having to decide, like, are we going to stay in this house? Like, are we going to continue this residency, which we've always wanted to be critical about throughout our entire experience? Is this care practice for us to be in this house, sitting with this heaviness 24/7? And, it's illuminated for me this idea that, like, actually, this is all around us, and I knew that before, but I did not feel it in the same way. And in truth, there's no difference from me in the Esek Hopkins house and like the students at Brown University, or the people going through Kennedy Plaza, or every single one of us living on this earth together, So this concept of historic intervention is something that we'd like to invite everybody to try on. This idea, like, you don't need an artist residency for your life to be an act of resistance, and having those visual symbols, that shadow work that Fumi is referencing, like, it's helpful because it helps us feel. And I think that's why we need artists at this point in time in the world, and is to help us feel, because I just don't believe we're going to think our way out of racism. We're certainly not going to like workshop our way out of racism. We're going to feel our way out of racism. We're going to feel our way out of colonization. So yeah, I mean, it's been tremendously heavy, and in some ways, like, moving out of the house, I imagine there'll be like some heaviness lifted, but I also think we're going to carry that heaviness with us for the rest of our lives, because that heaviness is just more awareness that we're holding, and more intention as well. So I can say, for me, I won't speak for my family, but I feel a hell of a lot stronger because of it.
Yeah, in my experience, generally speaking, and concerning this residency specifically, I always struggle with the concept of where history starts, or what is historical. Why is it historical, and who made it so? That continues to be an ongoing struggle with me, both, artistically, socially, politically. Whose history is it? I think for me, like and also, the advent of documentation and evidence um, and how, in terms of history and historical, preservation, or how we value and evaluate, tends to be, weaponized mechanisms, and mechanisms of erasure, mechanisms of oppression, um, mechanisms of othering, or what else have you. Um, so for me, even thinking about, the park that I occupy, like, did that, though, you know, history was historic, was not as historic, how folks who can access, how can they access land, um, are, yeah, and the difference and what that means in terms of, um, colonial history and culture and indigenous history and culture. Um, what I'm interested in, the stories that come with this land. I'm curious to know, um, what cultural practices were exercised on this land. Um, what what other beings were on this land. Looking at this land, you you wouldn't be able to tell. And where history starts on this land is not inclusive of, those questions or answers that I'm interested in. Um, yeah. So
Well, and Fumi, like that's this idea of when history starts, rings really powerfully for me because Isak Hopkins, like the plaque on his house is still on his house to this day. And what he's celebrated for in our community is being the first commander of the US Navy. He's celebrated for the colonization, which he was dismissed from the position by George Washington, by the way. But regardless, it represents the colonization of this land, the successful colonization of this land. He's celebrated as that and as the beginning of our country. And so you point to this important point that this question of like whose history matters and where does history begin. And we experienced that in real time in the sense that like suddenly people were like paying attention to our work as artists after just like a few weeks of living in the home. Like before we even created anything or shared anything, our work suddenly mattered because of our new proximity to whiteness, because of our new proximity to history that matters. People cared about our work before we even really did anything to earn that care or that attention. It was just simply our proximity to whiteness. And when we investigated that dynamic as it was playing out, we became also awakened to this reality that historic preservation is an industry. Historic preservation as an institution is an industry that profits from the maintenance of white supremacy, that profits from the maintenance and the elevation of symbols, architecture, systems, and figures that represent colonization, slavery, genocide, patriarchy. So, we're really interested in that is how historic preservation has functioned. This idea that the home is worth preserving, that resources are poured into the home's maintenance and preservation. We sit in that space of like the reality that we have letters from Isak Hopkins from his first voyage of the slave ship Sally, that those have been preserved in Brown University's library. In many ways, it's like a great thing that we have these sources, and there's so much missing. So it's both like infuriating and it is illuminating as well, because even though we're forced to read between the lines, there's still a lot of information there to look to. So for us, the call for the future is for historic preservation to function as an institution, an industry that profits from the maintenance of all history and culture, and really tries to represent the times with more accuracy and an anti-racist lens, frankly.
So, wow. So one of the things that I hear, and I heard it in Fumi and I hear it in Garza in your follow-up, is really, to me, it's something I'm a little bit obsessed with, is the problem of the archive. And so when Fumi says, who made it so? What is historical? Who gets to count as history? It's about, and you talk about documentation and evidence, it's about who gets to find their way into that archive. And I mean the archives writ large. There's lots of little archives that we talk about. I mean writ large, about whose stories, and is it the stories of the indigenous people? Is it the stories of enslaved persons? Is it the stories of the Latinx community, of queer and BIPOC and transgender peoples? Like, those are not the stories that traditionally make it into the archive, right? And so one of the things that I find fascinating, particularly Fumi, with your work, is like creating an archive in some ways through the study of indigenous plants and through the indigenous food. You're creating like an alternative archive is what I would argue that I see it as. And then Garza, I also just wanted to respond to the idea of the heaviness of space. I work on slavery. I visit a lot of historic sites, and I'm always struck. For example, I visited all those plantations on the River Road in Louisiana. How infuriated those spaces make me after just, an afternoon of visiting a slave plantation. And this idea that somehow it's just a tourist stop. It's not. It's where bodies were brutalized. It's where women were raped. It's where people were stripped of their rights. And so those kinds of spaces have really deep legacies that don't just get erased when we put over, when we relabel it, for example. That just doesn't do the work. But I think your point too about historic preservation might make people really uncomfortable. But the reality is, if we look at what's historically preserved across the U.S., it tends to be sites associated with white life in America, and less so with showing a really broad scope or broad consideration. So I just wanted to respond to that. I realize we're at 5:40, so Micah, shall I see if there's any questions from the audience? Because I have plenty to still ask you, but is there any questions that from the chat? I think that I can keep on talking and asking you things, so. Micah says, let's see, he's going to check out. I think we're going to be okay. Nope, there's no. So I'm going to, if you have a question out there for our faithful few who are here attending, please ask. I'm happy to stop and present your question. And you can raise your hand and we can call on you. So I want to shift a little bit. So I'm thrilled with the way that I like talking with you about your work and how powerful it is, and how really what's at stake, right, in doing the kinds of work that you're doing, and this kind of upending colonial attitudes and trying to reshape, like, who gets to be in certain spaces, who gets to tell the stories. So one of the things that I'm really interested in both of your work is this idea of what we might, the tension between like craft, adornment, materiality. There's something really tactile about all of the work that both of you are creating. And I wonder if you could just address that issue as well. And I think with the Glitter House, obviously this idea of embodiment embodies bridging future space, this beauty of adorning your bodies at the House of Glitter. Is super important, right? Every time I see those photographs with you all fully dressed in your purple, I'm like, yes, there's something really powerful about seeing that. But also, Fumi, the work that you're doing as well that ties to that.
Well, for us, I think beauty has been a coping mechanism. I don't know if we could have survived the last 18 months without paying attention to our beauty and radiance. So there's that, like the stories that we're called to tell, honoring the legacy of the woman who hung herself on the first voyage of the slave ship Sally, commanded by East Hopkins. We did have a choice. Like, this can be a nightmare, and it is a nightmare. But when we bring beauty to it, well, it's easier for us to embody, and that's why we too are really like bringing beauty to imagine the future, not to cloak the past with beauty, but to just we need for our preservation to like imagine a more beautiful world. And so adornment, you know, is a shield, is like a protection in many ways. And so when we think of like adorning our bodies or costumes, drag, and sculpture and installation and performance, you know, we had a you know, community cultural rituals last year with elders and with primarily elders of color coming to the house, and that adornment, placing objects onto altars in front of the house, it creates that is how we shift that feeling that you get when you go to a museum where people were enslaved, by actually bringing different objects, actually bringing different histories and new histories, new actions. You know, our experience has been beautiful. We've had many beautiful days with beautiful dialogue and beautiful people and beautiful conversations and beautiful movements and beautiful tears and emotions. And so there's that piece. And then the other reality is that, like, for our work to be palatable and digestible, we've also had to be strategic. Like that's just real. Like, you know, we're, particularly with this activist dance opera, you know, we are illuminating some missing history. And for our audience of color, we expect that will feel very validating. But not necessarily, you know, a shock to the system. And for our white audience, you know, we are interested in having them stay for the whole show. And so, you know, the reality is, like, glitter helps. Like, glitter helps to make it more digestible. And that's a very, like, complicated idea, because we are not trying to cloak or mask the horrors of our past. But it is both. It is both like an interest in, like, I would like for 5-year-olds to be able to witness our work, and you know, I would love, so there is a little bit of like beauty in that aesthetic and that adornment, especially the participatory elements. Like our show that we're putting on this September, like, is going to have installations made by like young people from Providence to New York. So there's like this participation aspect of, like, we are adorning this together and creating this force field, creating this shield, creating this armor for ourselves to engage in these truths. And the truths are laid out. They are not beautiful. So yeah, it's a complicated answer from us.
And those two things are always, I think, that beauty and the ugliness, right, of the reality are kind of in this conflict, right, in your work, or working maybe together in your work. And
that's not to say that, like, you know, horror cannot be visually appealing and visually beautiful as well. I mean, I think that's another piece of our aesthetic, that, like, horror, queer horror, you know, and those mediums are also very inspiring to us. So, you know, we do find beauty in the profane and in the grotesque, and aesthetic beauty, but that's also problematic, because human suffering is not beautiful.
That's right.
Yeah, I think on that note, so I feel like adornment has shown up, you know, in my studio practice and in this residency in different ways. In terms of the space that we occupy, my partner has adorned this space with native flowers and wildflowers that were not here, or that were not, or having trouble growing. Those are the ways in which this space has been, the physical space, the land has been, I would say, readorned. And in terms of like the aesthetics of my artwork, I want to pick up on what Garza was talking about in terms of what would be considered the grotesque, I think in terms of visual aesthetics and essential elements in my work, um, the grotesque shows up as glitter. In terms of like
Mm.
when I talk about when I'm talking about sort of the aesthetic themes that I'm contending with, um, which would be, considered dark or shadow. Um, that's showing up as, rose gold, that's showing up as
Mm.
magenta, that's showing up as um, Ankara pattern, that's showing up as indigenous patterns in my work, in the way that I adorn landscapes and figures in my pieces, whether that be 2D digital works, whether that be 3D installation works. Um, so I think for me, there is, a fine line between creating a dichotomy in terms of like what is light, what is dark, what is light work, what is shadow work, and associating them with, good and bad or good and evil, um, and whether that be in like unconscious or implicit. Um, I think that in terms of experiences and histories that show up in my work, especially in my research, um, as whether I'm showing up as an artist, whether I'm, showing up as a curator, critic, educator, organizer, whatever you want to call it. Um, I think that there isn't um, between, especially in terms of aesthetic values in my work, there is no way of pulling them apart. They're intrinsically intertwined. Um,
Okay.
so yeah, and and also in terms of aesthetics and adornment, like what stories can be told through aesthetics and adornment are really important to me in my practice. Um, and I think for me, a value that I have as an artist, if we're going to tell the story, we're going to tell the whole story. Um,
Mhm.
and how can that be represented in work, or start to represent it? Because the challenge is always going to be, how can one capture all of this, or even just component parts of it. So,
Mhm.
mhm.
And
Yeah.
there's also, I appreciate this question because it's making me think about like, or reminding me that a big part of like our practice to bring adornments and to bring beauty, and beauty that is in lineage with Afro-diasporic, Latinx, indigenous cultural tradition, which are not necessarily viewed as contemporary notions of beauty, or not historically been seen as beautiful. And I think about like, you know, when people look at the state house and say it's beautiful, or someone's fair skin and say it's beautiful, or like when I'm dancing with my partner at the Dark Lady downtown and someone grabs his hair because it's beautiful without asking, because it's beautiful. And so they're just, beauty is such a political concept on so many levels. And so having, as an artist, I think, and this concept of finding our aesthetic, it's so important because it really hones in on like, what is the beauty that I'm bringing into this world, and where is it derived from, and what does it validate, and who does it validate, what narratives does it validate and reinforce, what systems does this beauty that I'm putting out into the world maintain.
Well, and I
And I
think
think,
Fumi's notion. Go ahead, Fumi.
and I was just thinking, this, reflecting on what you all are saying, even just from an exhibiting artist perspective, like what you're expected to present as beauty, um, in terms, especially when you're talking about, um, if you're specific in your work being um, uh, relating to the Black experience and Black identity, relating to Indigenous experience and Black identity in the Western art market. That really starts to get complicated and convoluted when we start talking about beauty, adornment, and aesthetic value. Because what I'm bringing to the table in terms of like Blackness and indigeneity and beauty in my digital work is not what tends to be expected or tends not to be valued in the market. I mean, and you know, that brings up questions of, do I want to, you know, participate in that market to begin with? Mm-hmm.
And if it is accepted, it might be tokenized, commercialized, or compromised in some way.
You know, I think that notion of disruption that your work is doing is really important, but also I think in Fumi's words, this idea of telling the whole story, that this reference, you're not just, and I appreciate that critique tremendously, that it's not this little narrow thing you're trying to do. You're trying to really open wide, if you could see my arms, so that we can really think not only about the art making that you're doing, but also really the community engagement that it does as well. Like, I see your work is so rooted in these conversations with community and trying to get all of the communities we've been talking about in dialogue with each other, but also it may be disruptive that conversation happens, and that's also okay. But I think for people to start to see this kind of colonial mechanism at work, and then to actually kind of rethink, what is art making? What are the stories that we're telling? How are we readorning the land? And why is that necessary, deeply necessary? Micah, I see that it's 5:54. Shall I continue? Or I know that we're done at 6, is that correct?
Yeah, we are going to try to shut it down at 6, but yeah, maybe some wrapping up ideas would be good to just give everyone some space to think.
Yeah, so just in general, one of the things that's really struck me listening to you in the last couple of minutes is to think that this, and I keep using, you know, I return to your words, that this disruption of beauty, and that you're opening up space for us to re-examine these kinds of contexts. And I think, Fumi, you said you use glitter sometimes is the grotesque, and that, you know, magenta and pink can be the dark. Like, you're completely turning it up on its head, like what our expectations of what your work should be doing and can do. And I think, Garza, you're doing the same thing within the fact of reaching out so broadly in your community programming. I mean, the kinds of things that you are doing with your summer camps, that you're doing with visitors to the site, with performance, with yoga, with meditation. So I guess if we could end, I'm not sure this will summarize at all what we've talked about this afternoon, but if you each could just take a few minutes to think about how or to respond to the idea and connections your work make to community, like in collaboration. Why is that important to the work you do? Like, why can't you just go off and be in the house and make it and not ever talk to anybody about it? Like, why is it important to engage community?
I mean, simply put, that's the way of my people. I don't know how to be any other way. Sorry, I cut you off, Garza.
I was gonna reference that you mentioned that at the beginning of that is just community is the ancestral way, you know, and just that insistence to collaborate, to let go of ownership, to invite other people's perspective, and to build systems that thrive from collaboration and from community involvement, because many of our systems like break when community gets involved, and then we view community as the problem because it broke the system, but we should view the system's design as the flaw. So community is not the problem. Community doesn't slow the work down. The system is not designed to thrive with community's involvement. The system is not designed to thrive from everyone's liberation and care. So insisting to be collaborative, you know, has many multiplicitous benefits in itself, in just that, like, the sum is greater than the sum of all the parts. But it's also an act of disruption in itself, away from this symptom of white supremacy culture, which is so individualistic. The way we are socialized in our school system, you know, group collaboration is like cheating, you know, because it's so individualistic, and we're so socialized and ingrained in this industrial factory of schooling, this incredibly outdated model of schooling that we inherited, to not work collaboratively. So yeah, it's both necessary for the work to be done with integrity for us and to honor our ancestral practices, but it is also, you know, as all the things we've discussed, an act of resistance to say, you know, neither of us have come into this residency and proceeded to be solo artists, you know. You know, we've continued, the door is open, and as soon as both of us, you know, entered this residency, our elder, I know this is true for both of us, our elders like understood the importance and value of it. And I know, like, I had many a lecture over the phone from from elders saying, like, you need to keep this door open. Like, this is not just about you. This is about the people who will come before you and the people who will come after that. So remember that, you know, and we do our best to.
Yeah, we got our ancestors and elders all up and through here.
So I wanted to just say just many thanks to Fumi and Garza for coming here this afternoon and participating. This has been I can't wait to meet you when I move to Providence. I really look forward to seeing your work and participating on September 9th and onward. But I appreciate your deep thinking and your work and your community work that you're doing. So thank you very much. You can't see, but we'll give a round of applause. And someone in the chat just wrote, "This has been so generous and generative. Thank you so much." And great work, everyone, from Micah. So thank you very much for joining the panel this afternoon.
Thank you for holding space.
Mm.